He was a Navy SEAL trying to disappear from the noise of war. But on a night when the blizzard swallowed the mountains, he found a truth that stopped his heart. A wounded police officer and her loyal K-9 were hanging in the snow, bound, silenced, and left to die. The storm was meant to finish what cruelty had started, and the only thing standing between them and the cold was the man who had come there to escape violence, only to find it waiting at his door. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please make sure to subscribe for more. Your support truly means the world. Snow swallowed Pine Hollow in heavy silence, burying roads, trees, and memory beneath a white sky that pressed low and unforgiving over the mountains. Ryan Cole arrived at the cabin just before dusk, his truck cutting a narrow wound through the drifts before the storm closed in behind him like a door that would not reopen easily. He was 33, tall and broad-shouldered in a way that did not come from weight rooms, but from years of carrying other men's lives on his back. His frame was lean and hard, built for endurance rather than comfort, and it moved with an economy that never wasted a gesture. His face was sharply angled, the jawline squared by discipline, the cheekbones prominent beneath weathered skin burned slightly darker by sun and salt from places far warmer than New Hampshire. A short, uneven beard clung to his jaw, not from style but neglect, and faint scars traced his knuckles and forearms like a second map of places he did not speak about. His eyes were a muted gray-blue, steady and observant, but dulled by something heavy that no amount of rest had yet lifted. Ryan had come here on leave, though the word felt dishonest. Leave implied permission to step away. What he carried did not respect permission. The mission had failed weeks ago, objectively, strategically, catastrophically, and the men who did not make it home followed him everywhere, not as faces, but as weight. Their absence pressed against his ribs when he breathed. One of them had been younger, reckless in laughter, always the first to volunteer and the last to complain. That man's death had not broken Ryan in a dramatic way. It had done something worse. It had hollowed him out quietly, leaving him functional, calm, and relentlessly awake. The cabin sat at the edge of a dense stretch of forest, a low structure of dark timber and stone that looked as though it had grown from the mountain rather than been built upon it. It belonged to no one Ryan knew, rented through a local contact who asked few questions and accepted cash without comment. That suited him. He unloaded his gear methodically. Food, fuel, a medical kit far more advanced than any civilian vacationer would need, and secured the doors and shutters before night fully settled. The storm thickened as the light faded, snow sweeping sideways between the trees, erasing the narrow road and reducing the world to a few dozen feet of shifting white. Inside, the cabin smelled of old pine and cold ash. Ryan lit the fire, stacked wood within reach, and checked the generator with the same precision he once used to check weapons. His hands moved on instinct, steady and practiced, even as his thoughts wandered to places he had come here to avoid. He told himself the silence would help, that the distance from noise and command would let his mind settle. He told himself many things. None of them quite landed. As the wind began to rise, something subtle shifted in him. It was not fear, it was familiarity. The sound of the storm outside, once just weather, began to take on edges, patterns, rhythms that tugged at old instincts. He moved to the window, scanning the tree line without fully knowing why. The forest stood motionless under the snow, dark trunks rising like pillars into the blur of falling white. No movement, no tracks he could see from here. And yet the sensation remained, a low hum beneath his thoughts, the same one that had warned him seconds before ambushes overseas, seconds before everything went wrong. Ryan forced himself to step back, reminding his body that this was not a mission zone. He was alone, he was safe. But his pulse did not slow. He found himself pulling on his winter jacket again, heavier than necessary, the fabric stiff with cold. He checked his flashlight, clipped it to his belt, and stepped back outside, boots crunching into fresh snow that was already filling his earlier tracks. The storm clawed at his face immediately, needles of ice stinging his skin, the wind tugging at his coat like impatient hands. He moved around the perimeter of the cabin, scanning the ground, the trees, the slope that fell away toward a narrow ravine beyond the property line. His breath came out in controlled plumes, each one counted without conscious thought. He noticed details without trying, the way snow had piled unevenly near one cluster of trees, the way a branch hung lower than it had earlier, bent beneath fresh weight. None of it should have mattered. All of it did. The memory of his fallen teammate surfaced again, uninvited. Not the moment of death, but the quiet afterward, when Ryan had sat awake in the transport, hands clasped, staring at nothing while the others slept. The same quiet pressed in now, thick and watchful. He realized then that he had not come to Pine Hollow to heal. He had come to stand still long enough for whatever was broken inside him to finally catch up. Somewhere beyond the edge of the cabin's clearing, the forest shifted. It was not a sound so much as an absence of sound, a pocket where the wind seemed to falter for a heartbeat. Ryan's posture changed instantly, spine straightening, shoulders squaring as his focus narrowed. He raised the flashlight and cut a beam through the snow, the white light tunneling into the storm. The trees answered with silence, their shadows stretching and collapsing as flakes crossed the beam. He told himself again that there was nothing out there, but his body did not listen. His training, carved into muscle and bone by loss and repetition, would not let him turn back yet. The storm howled louder, and Ryan took another step forward, unaware that this quiet, frozen moment was about to tear open the solitude he had come so far to find. Ryan moved deeper into the forest as the storm tightened its grip, the flashlight beam slicing through the snowfall in a narrow, trembling corridor. The ground sloped unevenly here, a mix of frozen earth and half-buried roots, and his boots sank with a dull resistance that slowed each step. He noticed the disturbance first not as a shape, but as imbalance. Snow piled where it should not have been. A faint arc pressed into the powder as if something heavy had swung and settled again. His chest tightened, and the familiar shift took hold, the one that sharpened his senses and quieted everything else. He followed the disturbance until the trees opened into a small clearing, and there the storm revealed what it had been trying to hide. Suspended from a low, thick pine branch was the body of a woman, hanging just high enough that her boots did not quite touch the ground. Thick rope bit into her wrists and ankles, hoisting her at an angle that twisted her spine unnaturally. Her mouth was sealed with dark tape, stiffened by ice, and her breath emerged in faint, uneven bursts that barely disturbed the air. She wore a torn winter jacket over what had once been a police uniform, the fabric ripped and stained, frozen stiff where blood had met snow. Her hair, a deep chestnut brown, hung loose and matted against her cheeks, strands crystallized with frost. Even in that state, there was a rigidity to her posture, a stubborn refusal to go slack that spoke of training and endurance. She was in her early 30s, athletic in build, shoulders strong beneath the damage done to her, the kind of strength earned through years of physical work and discipline rather than vanity. Beside her, bound to a neighboring branch, hung a German shepherd, his powerful body pulled awkwardly by the restraints around his torso and legs. He was a mature working dog, around 5 years old, large even for his breed, with a thick black and tan coat dulled now by snow and ice. His hind leg was slick with frozen blood, and his breathing was labored, each inhale a visible effort. Yet his head remained angled toward the woman, his dark eyes half open but alert, tracking her slightest movement with unwavering focus. Even strung up and injured, his posture carried the unmistakable authority of a trained K9, a protector whose instincts refused to surrender. His ears twitched weakly as Ryan approached, and a low vibration stirred in his chest. Not a bark, not a growl, but a sound of presence, of warning, of refusal. Ryan did not hesitate. The sight struck him hard, but it did not paralyze him. It narrowed him. He moved with controlled urgency, snow spraying as he crossed the last few yards. His knife appeared in his hand without conscious thought, the blade catching the beam of the flashlight as he assessed the knots. They were not amateur bindings. The rope was thick, weather-resistant, tied with practiced efficiency meant to hold under strain. This was not cruelty born of impulse, it was intent. It was message. He positioned himself beneath the dog first, bracing his weight, and cut through the rope with a single clean motion. The shepherd dropped heavily into his arms, a solid, living weight that Ryan absorbed against his chest. The dog trembled violently, muscles spasming from cold and shock, but did not resist. Ryan lowered him carefully to the ground, clearing snow from beneath him and shielding his body with his own for a brief moment to block the wind. The dog's eyes flicked back toward the woman immediately, and Ryan followed that gaze without thinking, already moving again. He cut the woman down next, supporting her shoulders as the rope gave way. Her body was dangerously light, her temperature alarmingly low even through layers of fabric. He laid her flat, quickly checking her breathing and pulse, noting the shallow rhythm, the stiffness in her limbs. The tape over her mouth cracked as he peeled it away, revealing lips tinged blue, jaw clenched against the cold. Her eyes fluttered but did not open. She was alive, barely. Ryan worked fast, methodical, stripping away the bindings and rubbing warmth back into circulation where he could, knowing it would not be enough out here. The storm howled around them, the wind now shrieking through the pines as if angered by the interruption. Snow began to fill the shallow impressions where they lay, trying to reclaim them. Ryan pulled off his own heavy coat and wrapped it around the woman's torso, then used it again to shield the dog, pressing close, creating a pocket of heat where none should exist. As he lifted the woman, he felt the strain immediately, the awkward weight of an unconscious adult combined with deep snow and rising wind. He adjusted, hoisting her securely, his muscles protesting but holding. He made a second trip for the dog, cradling the shepherd against his chest the way he once carried wounded men, their blood soaking into his uniform as he ran. The dog's head rested against his shoulder, breath warm and uneven against his neck, a small living defiance against the cold. The walk back to the cabin felt longer than it should have. The forest seemed to close in, branches clawing at his sleeves, snow thickening with every step. Ryan's lungs burned, his vision narrowing, but he did not slow. He reached the clearing, the dark shape of the cabin emerging through the white like a promise. Inside, the fire still burned. He carried them across the threshold, one by one, the sanctuary he had sought now transformed into something else entirely. As he laid them down near the hearth, snow melting into dark pools on the floorboards, Ryan understood with a quiet certainty that the peace he had come looking for had been an illusion. The war he carried had not followed him here by accident. It had been waiting, and now, bound in rope and frost and loyalty, it lay bleeding at his feet. The firelight threw long, restless shadows across the cabin as Ryan worked, and the space he had chosen for silence reshaped itself into a battlefield of a different kind. He laid the woman, Emily Parker, on a thick wool rug close to the hearth, rolling her with care that belied the hardness of his hands, stripping away ice-locked fabric and brushing snow from her skin before it could melt and steal more heat. Her build revealed itself as athletic and disciplined, shoulders squared even in unconsciousness, legs strong beneath torn uniform pants, the body of someone accustomed to long hours, physical strain, and the unglamorous weight of responsibility. Her face was pale, lips faintly blue, freckles barely visible beneath frost-bitten skin, and there were marks along her wrists and ankles where rope had bitten deep, purple bruises blooming as circulation returned. Ryan's movements were precise and economical. Layers off, blankets on, heat transferred gradually, circulation coaxed rather than shocked. He monitored her breathing without instruments, reading the shallow rise of her chest the way he once read men on the ground, knowing that impatience could kill as surely as neglect. Ranger lay a few feet away, positioned so he could see Emily even in his weakened state. Ryan had placed him on his side atop folded blankets, elevating the injured leg, packing snow away from the wound and cleaning it with warm water that steamed faintly in the cold air. The dog's size was imposing even while injured, a broad-chested German shepherd with a thick ruff around the neck and powerful shoulders dulled by exhaustion. His coat, once glossy black and tan, was matted with blood and ice, and his flank bore a deep gash where the fur parted to reveal angry, swollen flesh. Ranger trembled uncontrollably at first, muscles firing on reflex, but his eyes never left Emily. That vigilance was not simple instinct. It was learned loyalty, reinforced by years of working beside one human, sharing danger, reading subtle cues. Even feverish, his body angled toward her, a living barrier against whatever might come next. Ryan moved between them in a steady rhythm, a medic without a badge, a soldier without orders. He checked pulses, assessed injuries, noted patterns. The bindings had been uniform in type, the rope cleanly cut to length, the knots tied with practiced hands. Emily's injuries told a story too precise for chance. Bruising, consistent with restraint, impact marks, placed to cause pain without immediate death, exposure engineered to finish what violence began. Ranger's wound was not the wild tear of an animal attack, but a controlled strike meant to disable, not kill. Ryan's jaw tightened as the picture assembled itself in his mind. This was not random cruelty. It was punishment. It was a warning designed to be found too late. The storm outside intensified, wind hammering the cabin walls, snow rattling against the windows like thrown gravel. Ryan secured the shutters, slid the deadbolt into place, and brought his remaining gear closer to the hearth. The cabin smelled now of smoke, wet fur, antiseptic, and iron. He worked on Emily's extremities, massaging warmth back into her fingers and toes, monitoring for dangerous arrhythmias, easing her body back from the edge. When her breathing steadied, when the blue tinge faded slightly, a tension he had been holding without noticing loosened just enough to let anger seep in beneath it. Movement outside drew his attention again, not the frantic chaos of the storm, but something measured cutting through it. Headlights swept briefly across the snowbank near the tree line, then disappeared. Minutes later, a figure approached on foot, steady and deliberate despite the wind. Ryan adjusted his stance, positioning himself between the door and the injured, muscles coiling in readiness. The knock that followed was firm, controlled, neither panicked nor casual. He opened the door only after confirming the silhouette through the narrow gap. Sarah Miller stepped inside with the storm clinging to her like a second skin. She was in her late 30s, tall and lean, built with the functional strength of someone who lived outdoors year-round. Her posture was straight but relaxed, shoulders rolled back from habit rather than pride. Auburn hair escaped in practical braids from beneath her hood, snow melting into copper-dark strands along her temples. Her face was angular, lightly weathered, with pale green eyes that took in the scene instantly and without shock. There was a calm in her expression that came from familiarity with crisis, the kind earned through years as a park ranger responsible for vast stretches of wilderness and the people foolish or unlucky enough to get lost in it. She carried a heavy pack slung over one shoulder, movements efficient, hands already shedding gloves and reaching for supplies. Sarah assessed Emily first, then Ranger, her gaze sharp and methodical. She knelt, adding medical supplies more advanced than Ryan's civilian kit, reinforcing bandages, checking the dog's temperature, supplementing the heat Ryan had established. Her presence shifted the room subtly, not by taking control but by sharing it, two professionals working in parallel without the need for explanation. Sarah's history had shaped her into this. Years of responding to accidents no one else saw, of learning that panic wasted time and silence saved lives. The forest had taught her patience, and loss had taught her restraint. Together, they stabilized both victims further, the fire fed and the cabin secured as the storm continued to rage. Ryan found himself watching Sarah briefly as she worked, noting the same quiet competence he recognized in himself, the same lines etched by responsibility rather than age. When the immediate danger passed and Emily's condition steadied, Ryan stood back, wiping his hands on a towel stiff with drying blood and water. The realization settled in fully then, heavy and inescapable. He had come here to outrun the war that lived behind his eyes, to find a place where memory could not follow. But the war had changed shape, not disappeared. It had traded sand and heat for snow and silence, orders for choice. The cabin, once meant to be a refuge, now held the evidence of a larger fight pressing in from the dark. Ryan looked at Emily, at Ranger's vigilant form, at Sarah methodically packing her gear for what might come next, and understood that hiding had never been an option. Not for him. Not anymore. The storm did not ease, but the cabin grew warmer, steadier, as if the fire itself were holding the night at bay. Orange light flickered across the log walls and settled on Emily Parker's face, and after hours of stillness, something finally shifted within her. Her breathing changed first, deepening, then slowing into a rhythm that suggested return rather than retreat. Color crept back into her cheeks in uneven patches, and the tightness in her jaw softened. Ryan noticed it immediately, the way he always noticed the smallest deviation in a wounded body. He adjusted the blankets and stayed close, not touching unless necessary, letting the warmth do its work. Emily's eyes opened gradually, unfocused at first, pupils dilated against the low light. She was 30 years old, but exhaustion and trauma had etched lines far older around her eyes and mouth. Her gaze moved slowly, cataloging the unfamiliar ceiling beams, the maps tacked to the walls, the rifle resting within reach but not aimed. Confusion passed through her features, followed by a flicker of alarm as memory began to resurface. Her body tensed instinctively, shoulders drawing inward despite the pain that movement caused. Ryan remained still, presenting no sudden motion, no threat. Sarah was seated nearby, posture relaxed but attentive, hands wrapped around a tin mug that steamed faintly in the cool air. Emily's awareness sharpened as her eyes found Ranger. The dog lay on his side near the hearth, bandaged and wrapped, chest rising and falling with effort but consistency. His ears lifted weakly when her gaze settled on him, and his tail gave a slow, thudding sweep against the floorboards. The tension in Emily's body broke then, replaced by a rush of emotion that drained her strength all at once. She sank back into the blankets, eyes closing briefly as if grounding herself in the simple fact of survival. As the minutes passed, Emily's mind began to reassemble itself with the same determination that had carried her through the cold. Her features hardened, not with anger but with focus. The woman beneath the injuries emerged clearly, an investigator by nature, not merely by title. Years on the force had shaped her into someone methodical and stubborn, someone who followed patterns even when doing so made powerful people uncomfortable. That trait had been sharpened 8 months earlier when a routine overdose case had led her to inconsistencies in evidence logs, then to quiet pressure from supervisors to stop asking questions. Emily had not stopped. She had gone deeper instead, working alone, documenting routes, noticing how certain forest access roads were mysteriously cleared after storms, how seized fentanyl shipments vanished from storage with paperwork too neat to be honest. Sarah watched Emily closely as that resolve returned, recognizing it instantly. As a park ranger, Sarah had spent over a decade patrolling pine hollows surrounding wilderness. Her tall, lean frame, accustomed to long days on snowshoes and nights alone in watch cabins. She had pale skin, weathered by sun and wind, freckles scattered across her nose, and hair that once might have been worn loose but was now always braided tight for practicality. The forest had taught her self-reliance early, after an avalanche years ago had taken her mentor during a routine survey. Since then, Sarah trusted patterns more than assurances, and her reports over the last several months reflected that. She had documented tire tracks on closed service roads, chemical smells near abandoned sites, wildlife behavior disrupted along certain corridors. Each report had been acknowledged politely and then buried. Ryan absorbed the pieces as Emily's condition stabilized enough for clarity to return fully. The story formed not through spoken confession, but through the evidence etched into their bodies and gear. Emily's missing weapon, the absence of her phone, the deliberate nature of the bindings, the choice of location where exposure would do the killing without noise. The perpetrators had wanted her silent and forgotten, reduced to a warning hidden in plain sight for anyone who strayed too close to the truth. Ranger's injury told the same story. He had been neutralized, not slaughtered, shot or cut in a way that disabled rather than ended him, because the message mattered more than the blood. Sarah contributed her own confirmation through action rather than speech. She spread maps across the rough-hewn table, pointing to familiar ridges and valleys, tracing paths that connected Emily's suspicions to her own observations. Old logging roads, service trails marked as inactive, narrow ravines shielded from aerial view. The wilderness itself had been repurposed into infrastructure for crime, its silence weaponized. The fire popped and hissed as sap burned away, and the light caught the edges of the maps like veins of copper. Ryan stood apart from the table, arms crossed loosely, eyes fixed on the floorboards where melting snow darkened the wood. The war he had fled pressed close again, not as memory but as function. The sensation was both unwelcome and familiar. Failure overseas had stripped him of the illusion that skill guaranteed outcome. Men he trusted had died anyway. That knowledge had driven him here, to stillness. But the scene before him demanded the same thing the battlefield always had. Engagement. He felt the old calculus reassert itself, the weighing of risk. The acceptance that once seen, responsibility could not be unseen. Ranger shifted, gathering his strength, and dragged himself a few inches closer to Emily despite the stiffness in his wounded flank. Sarah adjusted his bandages gently, reinforcing them, checking for heat and swelling. The dog's eyes remained alert, tracking movement, guarding the fragile perimeter of the room with a focus that bordered on devotion. He was not merely recovering, he was waiting. By the time the fire burned lower and the storm's fury dulled into a steady roar, the shape of what lay ahead had emerged clearly enough to be undeniable. Emily was no longer just a victim. Sarah was no longer just a ranger with ignored reports. Ryan was no longer a man on leave. The cabin held them together in its circle of light, a temporary refuge forged not by escape, but by convergence. Outside, the forest continued to hide its secrets beneath fresh snow. Inside, the truth had found its voice, and it would not be quieted again. Morning broke without ceremony, a pale gray light filtering through the snow-laden branches and settling over the forest like a held breath. The storm had spent itself during the night, leaving behind a landscape scrubbed clean and deceptively calm. Ryan stepped outside first, testing the cold with the same caution he once used to test hostile streets. The air was sharp enough to sting, the kind that punished bare skin instantly, but visibility had returned. Behind him, Sarah moved with quiet confidence, pulling on her insulated jacket, auburn braid tucked neatly beneath her collar. Emily followed more slowly, wrapped in layers, her movements careful and deliberate, the stiffness in her limbs betraying the toll of exposure and restraint. Ranger emerged last, supported briefly by Ryan's steady hand, then standing on his own with a pronounced limp that he stubbornly ignored. Ranger was not healed, not even close, but something in him had shifted. His ears were upright now, his eyes alert and focused, scanning the woods with intent rather than confusion. The injury at his flank limited his speed, yet it did nothing to dull his purpose. Snow clung to his thick black and tan coat as he lowered his head and inhaled deeply, drawing the forest into his lungs. Years of training had refined his senses into tools more reliable than any map or satellite image. For Ranger, the pristine white ground was not empty. It was layered with information, compressed timelines and lingering traces of fear, metal, and human intent. Ryan watched the dog closely as Ranger began to move, slow at first, then steadier, following a line invisible to everyone else. The path led away from the cabin, curving back toward the small clearing where Ryan had found Emily and Ranger hanging from the pine. The forest here felt different in daylight, stripped of the storm's chaos and reduced to quiet clarity. Snowshoe hares darted in the distance, a crow perched high above, observing without interest. Ranger paused frequently, adjusting course by inches, nose skimming the snow, breath fogging the air in rhythmic bursts. At the edge of the clearing, Ranger stopped and shifted his weight, pawing lightly at a shallow drift near the base of a tree. Ryan crouched, brushing snow aside with gloved hands. The first object revealed was small and dark, half buried and dull against the white. A spent shell casing. Ryan examined it carefully without touching, noting its placement and orientation. The casing had been discarded intentionally or in haste, not flung randomly. Nearby, Sarah uncovered strips of black industrial tape, adhesive, stiff with cold, the same type used to secure heavy shipping crates rather than for improvised restraint. Emily's gaze hardened as the pattern grew clearer. Ranger moved again, guiding them a short distance downslope toward an area where the snow thinned beneath a cluster of low branches. He began digging with focused urgency, ignoring the pain that flared through his injured flank. Ryan intervened gently, taking over the task as Ranger stepped back, watching intently. Beneath the snow and frozen soil lay a small nylon bag, black and weatherproof, buried hastily rather than hidden carefully. Ryan retrieved it and carried it back toward the cabin, the weight of it heavier than its contents suggested. Inside, the bag was opened with deliberate care. A compact USB drive rested inside, along with several unregistered SIM cards sealed in plastic. Sarah's expression remained controlled, but her jaw tightened as she recognized the implications. Emily leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the items, the investigator in her overriding the exhaustion in her body. These were not personal effects, they were tools, disposable, efficient, designed to be used and erased. Ryan connected the USB to an offline laptop he kept in his gear, a hardened machine stripped of unnecessary connections. As the data loaded, the room seemed to contract around the screen. Files opened one by one, revealing encrypted logs, route schedules, warehouse manifests, and internal access codes. Emily's breath slowed as recognition set in. She scanned the information rapidly, absorbing it with the same precision that had drawn her into the investigation months earlier. The name surfaced without drama, embedded in authorization records and override commands that redirected patrol units away from critical corridors. Deputy Chief Tom Harris, Emily's direct superior, the man who had approved her transfer to investigative duty, who had praised her diligence publicly while quietly limiting her resources behind closed doors. Harris was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered with a carefully maintained beard that softened the severity of his features for public appearances. He was known for his approachable demeanor, a practiced calm that put citizens at ease and disarmed younger officers. That calm had been forged years earlier during a controversial shooting that ended his time on patrol and elevated him into administration, where distance from the street gave him control without exposure. For Emily, the betrayal cut deeper than shock. It explained the pressure, the missing files, the sudden isolation that had preceded her capture. Sarah folded her arms, studying the screen with narrowed eyes. Her reports had stalled under Harris's watch, routed through channels that led nowhere. The forest roads she documented had been cleared not by oversight, but by intent. Ryan stood slightly apart, arms loose at his sides, his expression unreadable. The sense of failure he carried from overseas shifted, transformed. This was not a mission gone wrong because of chaos or chance. This was wrought, calculated and patient. Ranger watched them from near the hearth, head raised, eyes tracking each movement. He did not understand names or politics, but he understood resolution. His role had been to find, to point, to connect. He had done that now, bridging the gap between suspicion and certainty, with nothing but his nose and his loyalty. Outside, the sun climbed higher, glinting off untouched snow and casting long shadows through the trees. The forest remained quiet, indifferent to human schemes. Inside the cabin, the weight of what they had uncovered settled heavily. The enemy was no longer faceless or distant. It wore a badge, signed paperwork, and walked the same streets Emily once trusted. Ryan closed the laptop carefully as if sealing something volatile inside. The cabin that had begun as a refuge, then a triage center, had now become a node of truth in a network built on lies. Ranger shifted again, settling closer to Emily despite the ache in his body, a silent affirmation that he would not move away from this fight, injured or not. The path forward was no longer hidden, and none of them could pretend they did not see it. Night fell early, heavy and absolute, the kind that swallowed sound and distance alike. Snow reflected faint starlight, turning the forest into a pale maze of shadow and glare. The cabin sat at its center like a lone ember, small and defiant. Inside, the air was taut with preparation. Ryan moved through the space with controlled efficiency, redistributing supplies, darkening windows, testing hinges and angles the way a craftsman tests joints. His posture had changed since the morning. The quiet fatigue that once weighted his shoulders had given way to a precise stillness. The posture of a man who accepted that motion, not rest, would decide the night. Ranger sensed it first. The German shepherd lay near the hearth, bandaged flank rising and falling in measured breaths, his coat brushed clean but still dulled by injury. He was 5 years old, seasoned, his muzzle slightly grayed at the edges from years of work rather than age. As darkness deepened, his ears lifted and rotated, tracking something beyond the walls. The low, almost imperceptible tension in his body sharpened. His tail stilled. He did not bark, he did not whine. He rose carefully, favoring the injured side, and placed his nose near the back door. Inhaling in short, precise draws, the forest had shifted again, not with weather, but with intent. Ryan read the signal immediately. He paused mid-motion, weight balanced, attention narrowing. He followed Ranger's line of sight to the rear of the cabin and then beyond, mentally mapping the approach vectors the terrain allowed. Sarah noticed too, her tall, lean frame stiffening as she secured medical supplies and cleared the center of the room. Her movements were economical, informed by years of responding to emergencies that did not announce themselves politely. Emily remained seated, wrapped in layers, her injured body still recovering, but her eyes tracked everything with sharp clarity. The investigator in her was fully awake now, cataloging details, anticipating patterns. Ryan slipped outside through the side door, using the cabin's shadow as cover. The cold struck hard, but he welcomed it. It kept him present. He moved low, scanning the ground near the woodshed where Ranger had earlier unearthed evidence. There it was. A thin, almost invisible line stretched knee-high between two saplings, dusted lightly with snow. A tripwire. Following it with his eyes, Ryan spotted the device it fed into. A crude, pressure-triggered explosive half buried beneath fresh powder, assembled quickly but with enough care to kill anyone forced through the back exit. The placement was deliberate. Someone had studied the cabin. Someone expected panic. Ryan disarmed the device with steady hands, isolating the trigger and burying the charge deeper into frozen soil to render it inert. He worked quickly, then shifted tactics. Using lengths of cord, empty cans, and shallow pits masked with branches, he transformed the clearing into a lattice of noise and confusion. None of it lethal. All of it designed to strip intruders of stealth and timing. When he slipped back inside, bolting the door behind him, the night felt closer, pressing against the walls. The attack came without warning. Shapes detached from the tree line moving with practiced coordination. They were not locals blundering through snow. They advanced in a staggered formation, rifles slung, steps measured to minimize sound. The first alarm sounded when a boot caught one of Ryan's improvised lines. Cans rattled violently, the sudden noise shattering the stillness. The attackers froze, then scattered, weapons raised. Snow exploded from the cabin walls as rounds struck thick timber, splintering wood and sending shards across the floor. Ranger moved despite the pain, positioning himself between Emily and the incoming fire, his body a living shield. His growl was low and continuous, vibrating through his chest, not fear, but warning. Sarah stayed low, hands steady as she prepared bandages and cleared space for movement. Ryan countered with precision, firing controlled shots not to kill but to suppress, forcing the attackers to ground. He tracked movement through shadow and snow, using sound and timing rather than sight. One of the intruders broke from cover, attempting to flank along the west side where the terrain dipped. He triggered a snare Ryan had set moments earlier, the cord snapping tight around his ankle and sending him crashing hard onto the frozen ground. Ryan closed the distance instantly, his movements fluid and decisive. He disarmed the man and secured him with practiced efficiency, dragging him back toward the cabin as the remaining attackers hesitated. Their advantage was gone. Surprise had failed. After a final exchange of sporadic fire, the shapes melted back into the forest, retreating as silently as they had come. Inside, the air rang with the aftermath. Smoke, the sharp scent of propellant, the crackle of the fire filling the silence left behind. The captured man sat bound, breathing hard, snow melting into dark patches beneath him. He was young, mid-20s at most, wiry rather than strong, his face marked by exhaustion and the shallow bravado of someone accustomed to acting on orders rather than understanding them. His clothing was practical and unmarked, chosen for anonymity rather than identity. Emily observed him with cold focus, noting the way his eyes avoided Ranger, the way his shoulders hunched as if expecting reprisal. Ryan stood close enough to be felt rather than seen, his presence heavy, unyielding. The man's resolve fractured under that pressure. Information spilled out in fragments, enough to complete the picture. The attack had been a cleanup operation, meant to erase witnesses before dawn. The larger movement, the one that mattered, was scheduled for 2 nights from now. A shipment large enough to consolidate the entire operation would pass through Granite Notch, a narrow canyon north of Pine, hollow, hidden from main roads and shielded from casual surveillance. Leadership would be present, oversight ensured. As the details settled, a shift occurred within the cabin. Fear receded, replaced by something harder and more dangerous: intent. Ryan felt it settle into him like armor. This was no longer about survival alone. It was about timing, terrain, and consequence. Ranger eased down beside Emily, injury forgotten for the moment, eyes still fixed on the door. The night pressed on, but it no longer felt unknowable. The hunt had begun, and now they knew where it would end. Granite Notch lay carved into the mountains like an old wound, a narrow canyon of stone and shadow where sound lingered and escape was an illusion. Before dawn, frost glazed the rock faces and the air cut sharp and clean, the kind that burned the lungs and sharpened the mind. Ryan moved along the upper ridge, low and deliberate, his silhouette broken by jagged stone. The man who had arrived weeks earlier seeking stillness now moved with certainty, his posture aligned to purpose rather than memory. Below him, the canyon floor waited, a funnel of snow-packed earth bordered by walls too steep to climb quickly, a place chosen not by chance but by consequence. Federal coordination had arrived quietly during the night, stripped of fanfare. The team was small, efficient, and anonymous by design. They were led by a senior field agent whose presence carried weight without theatrics, a man in his early 40s with close-cropped dark hair, a weathered face, and the calm bearing of someone accustomed to finishing difficult work. His agents took positions without wasted motion, establishing containment points at both ends of the canyon. Their gear was matte and practical, their movements synchronized through habit rather than command. They trusted terrain, timing, and restraint. Ryan noted the discipline with approval and adjusted his own placement to complement theirs rather than compete. Emily remained near the canyon's mouth, protected by rock and elevation. Her body still bore the marks of restraint and cold, but her stance was steady, shoulders squared beneath layers that hid the injuries without erasing them. The investigator in her had returned fully, sharpened by betrayal and survival. She tracked the approach routes, the wind direction, the places where sound would carry. Her eyes missed nothing. Nearby, Sarah worked methodically, checking Ranger's harness and the bandaging along his flank. Sarah's tall, lean frame was braced against the cold auburn braid tucked down her back, freckles stark against pale skin. The forest had shaped her into someone who understood patience as a tool and timing as a promise. She watched the canyon not as a battleground, but as a system about to be corrected. Engines murmured in the distance, then fell silent. 2 trucks eased into the canyon, their paths chosen to avoid detection, their headlights extinguished early. Men dismounted with practiced efficiency. Among them moved Tom Harris, unmistakable even in low light. He was broad-shouldered and solid, beard trimmed neatly, posture projecting authority that had once inspired trust. Tonight, that authority sagged beneath urgency. His careful calm, honed through years behind a desk, insulated from consequence, frayed at the edges as he surveyed the canyon. He carried himself like a man who believed control could still be reclaimed if he acted decisively enough. The transfer began quickly. Crates moved with haste rather than precision. Then something shifted. The federal containment closed like a held breath released. Floodlights snapped on from both ends of the canyon, bleaching shadow into stark relief. The sudden brightness froze motion mid-step, revealing fear and calculation in equal measure. Chaos followed, but it was contained, compressed by rock and preparation. Harris reacted not with surrender, but with desperation. He seized a child from among the coerced carriers, small, trembling, bundled against the cold, and dragged the figure close, his body angled to shield himself from the lights. It was an act born of panic rather than strategy, the final reach of a man whose power had always depended on distance and deniability. From the ridge, Ryan assessed the angle, the risk, the seconds available. He felt the old focus lock in, the quiet that preceded decisive action. Before he could move, motion surged from the canyon's edge. Ranger broke from cover, a black and tan blur against white stone, pain overridden by purpose. He ran with a hitch in his stride, but his speed was true. Years of training and devotion aligned into a single vector. The dog launched himself with controlled force, striking Harris at the hip and shoulder, not to maul, but to unbalance. The impact tore the child free and sent Harris sprawling, authority dissolving into helplessness on frozen ground. Ryan moved as the moment opened, closing distance with precision, ending resistance before it could reform. The federal team surged in tandem, securing the remaining suspects as the canyon's tension collapsed into stillness. The child was lifted away to safety, wrapped and shielded, the threat extinguished. Granite Notch exhaled, its role complete. Weeks later, the snow retreated from Pine Hollow, revealing earth and the first stubborn green along the trails. Accountability followed with the thaw. Emily stood restored to her role, her badge returned with formal recognition, her posture calm and unbowed. The work ahead was substantial, but it was clean work now, carried forward with support rather than obstruction. Sarah's months of ignored reports became the foundation for something new. A wildlife rescue and rehabilitation center funded through seized assets, a place for injured animals and retired working dogs to recover under watchful care. Sarah's expression when the doors opened was measured, but the satisfaction ran deep, a promise kept to the forest she had guarded. Ranger received his own recognition. A new collar sat proudly at his neck, bearing a small metal medallion that caught the light when he moved. The honor did not change him. He remained watchful, loyal, content to sit at Emily's side or patrol the perimeter of Sarah's center. Purpose fulfilled through presence rather than praise. Ryan did not stay long. He stood once more on a ridge above town, the air warmer now, the mountains less forbidding. The weight he carried had not vanished. It had changed shape. He understood finally that peace was not an absence of conflict or memory. It was the deliberate creation of safety, where chaos expected to rule. As he turned away, the quiet he felt was not escape. It was earned. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, in loyalty, in courage, in the moment someone chooses to step forward instead of walking away. God did not stop the storm in this story, but he placed the right hearts inside it, each carrying what the others needed to survive. Pain was not erased, yet it was transformed into protection, and loss became a reason to guard life more fiercely. In our everyday lives, we may never face a blizzard or a life-or-death choice like this, but we all meet moments where kindness, truth, and courage are required. Faith often means becoming the help we pray for. When we choose compassion over comfort, we take part in the quiet miracles God still works through ordinary people. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and loyalty. May God bless you, protect you, and walk with you through every storm. Amen.